Hey, John.
Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Did you know that I have a book coming out?
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
You know, is it? I see the excerpts out on the TNR website. Is the book physically available? Can people rush out and get one?
In fact, it's physically available at some select bookstores. It's not supposed to officially come out until September 12th, but some bookstores have put it out. I've seen a Borders in a couple places has been spotted. I was at the City Lights bookstore because I was in San Francisco for a wedding, and they happened to have it out. So they're sort of violating their protocol by putting it out before the official date.
So do you feel miffed at all that you didn't get the Harry Potter high security treatment there? Or
Well, you know, I guess they're taking a risk that hordes of teenagers are going to storm into the bookstore and start grabbing them off the shelves because they didn't follow the protocol.
I mean, I have seen there's sort of spoilers already all over the internet.
There's spoilers, I know.
The key plot points: who lives, who dies.
I know.
Jude Winniski's career winds up kind of ruined.
It's true. Yeah. No, a lot of it's been given away, and there have been no reports so far of any fatalities in bookstores because of rioting. But it's still early, so we can only hope the good news holds up.
Right. Well, you know, since this wasn't a Harry Potter book, you know, I actually got my hands on an advanced copy leaked out, and so I've read it, even though it's not officially out, and I thought it was great. I think you know, the viewers and so forth at home should check it out. You know, especially because it. I feel like the sort of the economic issues that it's about. What the subtitle is, you probably know what it is. But it's
I know what it is. Why don't we tell the viewers the title of the book?
Right. It's The Big Con.
The True Story of How Washington... The True Story... It's a long subtitle. The subtitle is roughly half the length of the book. It's the true story of how Washington got hoodwinked and hijacked by crackpot economics.
Right. And that's basically what it's about.
Yeah.
Which is good. It's the advantage of the long subtitle.
Yeah, we were thinking of subtitles which were a little more off point, like 100 great Thanksgiving recipes, but we just
1,001 things to do before you die.
Right.
That kind of thing. You know, and I feel like, you know, this sort of subject, the kind of like core meat and potatoes, you know, economic direction of the country kind of questions have gotten relatively less discussion over the past few years because war is sexier and more pressing and in some ways easier for people to argue about.
Right.
You know, but obviously the bulk of what the government does, you know, relates to taxing money, spending money, regulating people. And, you know, that's the way that the political parties are sort of organized primarily around their, you know, interest group bases and their views of the domestic economy.
Right.
You know, and so it's refreshing in some ways, you know, just to read something on that. And also, I mean, you argue that, you know, we should understand this as the real core sort of purpose of the Republican Party, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, I mean, that's sort of my argument is that this is the group that's really in charge of the Republican Party, that you have a lot of discussion of social conservatives, but I'm arguing that they're not really driving the train. They get a lot of policies that help them, but the Republican Party almost never expends social capital on their behalf. Really, what favors they get are things that can go below the radar or are not seen as unpopular. In foreign policy, you know, there has been a lot of talk of the neocons, but their influence is relatively recent, or at least the degree of influence is relatively recent, and I think it will be at least somewhat short-lived.
Right. No, I mean, I do think that's sort of right. You know, and so you see instead sort of the core being business lobbyists, basically in the interest of the wealthy, I guess.
Yeah.
You know, coming in, cutting taxes, turning the policy over to you know, kind of whomever. Well, to lobbyists to a large extent, right?
Exactly, right. You just have lobbyists just almost with no intermediaries whatsoever, making huge national policy decisions, almost writing bills creating legislation. Instead of being, and now they've always been lobbyists who have had some influence, but the degree of influence is something that's hard to find unless you harken back to the Gilded Age.
Right. And I mean, I guess, what's most interesting to me about the book, and also in some ways a little harder to understand is, how does one get away with this exactly? I mean, it's understandable why we all understand. I think that people with money have a lot of influence over what politicians do, so on and so forth. But how is it that the President of the United States and major candidates for office, your book obviously can't get into this, but Rudy Giuliani and Mitt Romney have all gotten up before audiences and talked about how tax cuts will increase revenues,
and Fred Thompson and John McCain too.
Right, and this doesn't turn them into laughing stocks.
Right. No, it's just run of the mill. That's kind of the second half of the book. The first half of the book is the transformation of the Republican Party from a relatively responsible party, the party of Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford Republicans on domestic policy, into the party of George W. Bush Republicans. And I guess my argument there is a little bit more complicated. But basically, I'm saying that there used to be a period that was called the Great Consensus after World War II, when you had a relatively moderate Republican Party and a Democratic Party who agreed on the basic questions of the role of government and argued sort of around the margins, with Republicans arguing for a little smaller government, a little more focus on deficit reduction, and Democrats arguing for more aggressive expansion of government. But there weren't huge ideological differences, and this was a great consensus, as it was called at the time, and how that broke down. So first you had the Republicans withdrew from that consensus and became far more radical in their domestic aims. But then you had a kind of superstructure of how politics was organized from this consensus that remained, and that proved totally inadequate to the challenges of what happens when you have a radical party. And you still have a lot of people who were reared in that previous time who don't understand how politics has changed and haven't adapted to it. The kind of most comic and extreme example is David Broder, who's kind of a whipping boy in the blogosphere, and I think for good reason, because he's just kind of living in the past. Always writing these columns about how taking some liberal goal and saying, well, both parties need to do something to solve this, right? Inequality is growing, but we really just need to get Democrats and Republicans, if they could just work together, they could solve it.
Together, stop this sniping kind of thing.
Right. Universal health insurance. Why can't the Democrats and Republicans just work together, as if the Republicans have any interest in this goal? And, and I think to, people who don't have as much of a historical memory, don't know what happened in the past, it just seems crazy. But it's not totally crazy. It's just it's just outdated. It's just like, it reminds me of the Simpsons episode where Mr. Burns wants to put together an all-star team of ringers for to beat the rival in softball, and so he produces a lineup of Pye Traynor and Honus Wagner and Tris Speaker, all these guys. So it's not like these guys were bad baseball players, but just they're all dead.
Sure.
That's what David Broder's columns are all like. He's just why can't we get, he's just living in the past.
Right. But, part of what's strange about this is that, I feel that if, John Edwards is running in the primaries, and he's running to the left on domestic issues, and, really trying hard to get union support, and so on and so forth. But if he went out on the campaign trail and started saying things that were clearly untrue. Started saying, I don't know what exactly. We can cut taxes and have universal health care and universal preschool and whatever else that he wanted to do. He would get in a lot of trouble for that. It would not be, even though it would be politically helpful if that were all true.
Right.
It would be a political disaster for him to start saying crazy things because. You and me and other people like us, the people who are supposed to be more or less sympathetic to his goals, would still be writing things like, oh, this is kind of embarrassing and wrong. And his opponents would be like, look, this guy's crazy. And it would be reported that way on the press. Edwards goes off the rails, starts speaking crazy nonsense. And a liberal would be on to say, it's really too bad that this promising campaign has worked out like that.
Exactly, poor man.
Yeah. And this doesn't happen at all. on the right.
Right. Yeah,
Right.
it's incredible. I mean, that part of it is just the way that this insane ideology of supply side economics has worked its way into the mainstream. And that's part of what it's about. It's not it doesn't have any actual academic legitimacy. And even the academic conservatives who support Republican policy goals aren't making the same arguments that Republican politicians are making. They're supporting this. They support the same ideas in general, but for different reasons, and would never actually endorse the logic that's used for them. That's some hidden agenda. We think in the long run it'll cause government to shrink, even though that's not exactly what they're saying. It's that sort of logic. But essentially there are no real supply siders in academia at all. It's just a crank ideology that has incredibly insinuated itself into the mainstream discourse. And now the other point I would make about how if Edwards started saying equally deranged things on the left, how he'd be criticized. I do think there is a kind of a difference between liberal and conservative punditry, and I wrote a bit about this in my piece about the netroots from a few months ago. But there is a certain ethos of not letting partisan considerations rule all in center left,
right.
journalism.
But I mean almost something even a little deeper than that, which is that even if you look at a blogger who's as partisan as you like, and would be maybe as willing to ignore inaccuracies or sins that Democrats made, in attacking Republicans. Still, when you have a situation like we have today, a primary where you have Democrats arguing with Democrats,
yep.
I would think, and I mean, I do think my experience with the more activisty type bloggers I know is that people don't like the idea of a candidate who would be saying weird, inaccurate stuff simply
right.
because you wouldn't trust a person like that. Right? I mean, if you're choosing between multiple members of your same political coalition, you
yep.
want the one who doesn't seem like he's out of his mind.
Right.
And pure partisanship doesn't even, I think, account for the sort of nonchalance with which some of this stuff passes through. Like, you see, like, they don't... I don't know. I mean, in this weird way, it seems to me, and not to be too shrill about it, but the conservatives don't really care. Don't take any conservative pundits don't take any
right.
interest in these kind of policy questions. So it doesn't really bother them.
You're right. I mean, I think the problem is that that most conservative pundits don't really care that much, or at least follow in much detail economics, and they basically say that's somebody else's job. There's we have this other guy on our staff or something who looks at that. But those people are all supply siders.
Right.
Those people are all
in National
total
Review, right? There's this special NRO financial unit with
right.
Larry Kudlow
right.
that deals with all these questions.
And fellow suppliers, right? And those people are just totally deranged. They're completely nuts. But you have a handful of these guys who write for the it's often the same people who write for the Weekly Standard and the National Review. Then of course the Wall Street Journal editorial page is sort of ground zero of the supply side movement, and they
right.
they just write these insane things all the time. And I think you've got a lot of other people who don't care about those issues or don't understand them that well or whatever. That's just that's their territory, but that territory is ceded to the supply siders, and no one challenges them on the right. So you've got this amazing way in which a really tiny number of people have leveraged control over a whole political party whose base by no means is inclined to support their arguments at all.
Right. Well, except that the point being that the financial base of the party is
that's
happy
right.
to. I mean, to whether or not they even believe it, right? I mean, that's part of the nature of these kind of things is that there are plenty of people whose interests it serves to fund think tanks that'll have supply siders, whether or not the funder even thinks this is correct. I mean, after all,
right.
It's hard to believe that there are all of these conservatives out there who really think that we need to cut taxes in order to increase revenue and expand the scope for government action.
Right.
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 I mean,
no,
that would be
there are
basically weird.
I mean, let me give you one data point to back it so it doesn't just seem like we're talking out of our.
Sure.
I cover this a little bit in the book. In 2000, when you asked Republicans, what should we do with the budget surplus, most of them said something other than cut taxes. There was much more preference for reducing the national debt. And that was the McCain position too. But and that was sort of my argument. Is that this is the thing that caused the Republican establishment to come down so hard on McCain, is that he deviated on the thing that you can't deviate on, which is tax cuts. And he went so far as to say, like the Bush tax cut is going to go too much to the rich, and when we don't need it in a time of rising inequality. And that's what I think made him such a pariah to the Republican establishment. It made them so intent on destroying him, and is why I think, however much he sold out and recanted and tried to work his way back into the good graces, they would never, ever forgive him for that.
Except that, so here's a point I want to get at, that like some substantial establishment figures, like Bill Kristol, right, is not like a marginal player in conservative politics. And, he was for McCain.
Right.
And there's also, you quote this in the book, this Irving Kristol line, I think, about how, the country needed a conservative majority, which meant a Republican majority, which meant we needed to make up some bullshit about tax policy.
Pretty much, yeah.
Right. I mean, that's not the literal quote, but that is what he said. In a way that suggests that he wanted to promote this idea and use the Public Interest, I guess, was the magazine he controlled, but that he and his circle were interested in promoting this idea for its instrumental utility.
And much more important, AEI. I mean, just a little detail is that it wasn't just publishing articles in the public interest, but AEI. But Kristol was known as the godfather of the neoconservative movement, and he apparently could just get money for anyone he wanted to get money for, and he got a lot of money for Winsky and these other supply siders as well. But sorry, go on.
Well, so that's what I'm getting at, though, is that Bill Kristol, Irving Kristol, this neoconservative sort of tradition seems to not necessarily have put these kind of issues at the forefront, both in terms of some of them supporting McCain when he was dissenting from the line, and also Irving Kristol, suggesting that this was like a tactical concession he wanted to make in order to achieve some other kind of goal.
That's right. Irving Kristol, was a cynic, and Bill Kristol is even more of a cynic, and I don't think they know or care about this theory at all, but are basically willing to support, that Irving Kristol supported supply-side economics because they thought it would be, and he said this, because it would be a useful vehicle for helping the Republican Party win elections and do things that he cared about on other things, social issues and foreign policy. Bill Kristol's the same calculation. Now, it looked for a time as if McCain was a better vehicle because McCain was supporting his foreign policy even more than Bush was, and McCain was a much more electable candidate in 2000 than Bush. Now, Bush happened to get elected, but by the skin of his teeth. McCain would have won easily. So, from Kristol's perspective, it was rational to support McCain in 2000, but then it became rational to sort of get back on board and get back on the Republican Orthodox train after Bush became president, which he did.
Right. I mean, I just wonder then, in your view, I mean, how, because whenever people talk about sort of the trajectory of American politics, the trick is always that the sample size is so tiny, right? And I mean, your book sort of makes it out that there's this kind of like really strong stranglehold of this kind of thinking on the Republican Party, which seems very true in a lot of ways. But then on the other hand, well, McCain did pretty well in his 2000 campaign. He made some mistakes too, some real ones, I think, as everybody does. And Bush very well could have lost the 2000 election. I mean, in some sense did. And maybe if Bush had gone down, then in 2004 Republicans would have had to have gone in a different direction, or maybe they will if they lose in 2008, which it sort of looks like they would, because as recently as Bush's father, right, there was a willingness to show some flexibility and pragmatism on these things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm arguing about a stranglehold that's slowly taken over 30 years. And that was the end. The 1990 budget deal where George W. Bush agreed to a small hike in the top tax rate and then was abandoned by most of the Republican Party was the end. After that, no one in Republican politics could ever agree to that again. and in their mind, they defeated the first President Bush and threw him out, and that was sort of the end point. And in 1993, President Clinton wanted to do something very similar to what the previous President Bush had done.
Right.
Cut spending and raise taxes a little bit, which is something you'd think that small government conservatives would have been able to sign on to, but zero Republicans in either chamber of Congress supported it. And that's pretty much the way it's been ever since.
Mm-hmm.
Now with McCain, I think the interesting thing about, McCain is, well, first of all, he didn't get a lot of, he did pretty well, but, the only two states he did well in New Hampshire and Michigan. He did well because he got a lot of support from non-Republicans in the primary. In any states where only Republicans could win, he got pretty well crushed. But I think it does illustrate there was a fair amount of grassroots support for him among the Republican Party. But where there wasn't support for him was among elites. Bill Kristol was very much an exception. And Kristol himself, it's hard to believe now, was almost getting run out of the Republican Party in 2000 for supporting McCain. He was really on the edge of getting run out of the Republican Party. He was being denounced. So there essentially was no elite support. And the amazing thing is the way that elites have been able to leverage support for a policy agenda that's so geared around the interests of K Street and supply siders when the base, it just isn't there at all.
But so, do you see, just no real prospect for this changing? Because, there's a certain line of thought, sorry, what am I trying to say? Right, there's a certain line of thought by, Ross Douthat and Brydon Salam, who I work with, are prominent examples of this. And I think you'll probably see more of if Republican political fortunes keep going down. That, precisely this has become the problem, that the, Republican Party is not going to be able to work politically, sticking to this kind of agenda. That at the moment, most of the major candidates seem very committed to it, but also all the national polls show them losing. So do you think this could change around in the near future, or is it
not in the near? Look, nothing's permanent. So will it be this way 50 years from now? I have no idea. But no, I don't see it changing.
But short term
at all. The whole look at the analysis of what conservatives say is wrong with them. They say we abandon our true government principles. And they often say, well, we need to recommit ourselves to an agenda of low government and low taxes. As if, that was why George W. Bush is doing badly. He hasn't cut taxes enough. Which is, of course, it's absurd, but that's really what they get down to. Most of the time they don't say it explicitly, but most of the time it's implicit, but sometimes they say explicitly, we need to get back to small government and low taxes and start cutting taxes again.
But what they say is that they need to get back to cutting spending more seriously, right? Which, while I think is dumb as an idea, right? That really would be doing something different from what George W. Bush has done. And so, so suppose that works, right? Suppose Fred Thompson really runs on a campaign that says, the problem is that we need to radically curtail, Medicaid spending or something. I feel like he's just going to get destroyed, and then maybe the situation needs to be rethought.
Well, he won't do that. He'll just do what they always do, which is just say we need to cut spending in general, which is a relatively popular thing to say. But they either won't try to really cut spending, or they will try to cut spending and they'll lose.
Right.
But in which case they'll just say, well, we deviated from our small government principles, which is what that's what they said when Newt Gingrich went down in flames. They said he moved too far to the left. He was too moderate. This is all sort of in the book how incredibly monomaniacal this mindset is. Any failure is proof of ideological deviation.
But do you think this is do you think this is a politically viable way for things to go? Because it seems to me that if you're right about that kind of inflexibility, that then, the Republicans are doomed in sort of electoral terms. That that they had this kind of freak pseudo win in 2000, followed by a terrorist attack that's been propping them up. But that if they really is no way to learn that their basic economic agenda is unpopular, that will kind of consign them to the dustbin of history, which doesn't seem like it even serves the interests of businessmen and rich guys and so forth.
Well, let me make a couple points. First of all, it's only unpopular in the specifics, right? When you say, would you rather have a tax cut for the top 1% or health care? That's unpopular. But if it's just say, well, I want small government and tax cuts for all, that's not unpopular.
Sure.
You know, to what extent will the actual specifics be translated to the public, and the public have a real clear understanding of what's going to happen? You know, it really gets diluted. The effect really gets diluted when it actually works its way through the political process. And I mean, that's part of what the book is about. Is you know, that was what the Gore campaign was desperately trying to do in 2000. It basically said, like, you know, we have this surplus. It was like an absolutely classic example of we have a pot of money. We have to decide what to do about it as a country. And what Gore wanted to do with the country was like wildly more popular than what Bush wanted to do with it, right? I mean, like on the specifics, it was 80 to 20. That was the big question that they were debating. And
Right.
Gore wasn't even close. But look at how it actually got translated to the public. It wasn't clear at all, you know. And I mean, I've got example after example of this in the book. It just wasn't. It just in no way was translated to the public what the actual differences were. That's point number one. Point number two, there are a lot of things Republicans could do to make up, even if they had a deficit on these domestic questions. You know, anytime there's an election on foreign policy, that
Sure.
tends to crowd things out. And usually, like I say, you know, they run on personal character, which is what more journalists pay attention to. It's what more people in the public pay attention to. I mean, I tend to think it's completely nonsensical the way people understand character. At all. I mean, I think if you're looking through some refracted lens that bears very little relation to the actual character of the people, but character tends to be a much more important issue anyway. So so basically, you know, I would rephrase what you were saying is, well, the Republicans have this fairly small political liability that they can carry and try to make up for in other ways.
But so you just see the country is doomed, basically.
No, I mean, I don't think. Look, I mean, I guess I'm a cynic, but you know, I think power swings back and forth between the parties for reasons that are often fairly random. You know, the Clinton sex scandals, you know, caused a huge change in policy because Clinton couldn't keep his pants zipped.
Right, but you know, but even if the partisan control swings back and forth, right? I mean, what Republicans seem to me to have established is this kind of this sort of like Reagan, Clinton, Bush cycle is advancing conservative goals, you know, and I don't think you need to be like one of the more extreme, you know, Clinton skeptics on the left to see that, you know, what his brand of governance, I mean, complete with the political constraints and everything else he was operating under, is like not, it's not good enough, right? If you're going to have 8 years of basically giving away the store and wrecking the country, and then a Democrat needs to come in and essentially make classic conservative compromises about, you know, bringing in some additional revenue, but also restraining spending growth, you know, make all kinds of tough political choices, and then as soon as the budgetary situation is brought back into equilibrium, you know, in come the Republicans again with a huge tax cut. That's not, you know, even if you want to say that those kind of, this sort of Clinton, you know, technocratic bit in the middle was good and was well done and good people were involved with that. It doesn't seem to be like an adequate response to the
I totally agree.
I
totally agree. And I've changed on this. I mean, I was having debates with people in the late 1990s where I thought, you know, I was sort of defending the Clinton economic program against the critics from the left. And I think that would have been the right position if Clinton could have been president for life, or, you know, et cetera, you know, Clinton-esque characters, and if Robert Rubin or people like Robert Rubin would be Treasury Secretary forever. But given the fact that, you know, you're going to alternate power with George W. Bush-type Republicans, no. It didn't work out. It didn't work out. They should have done, you know, at the end, you know, like the classic debate at the end when the surplus started to appear, when the whole Clinton argument was, let's save it, let's save it, let's save it. But then you just saved it so that George W. Bush could give it to the rich.
Right.
So, you know, it would have been much better to shovel the money out the door and get it to, you know, assign it in some way that is far from perfect, but much better than the way that Bush did.
Right, lock it into something somewhat worthwhile.
Yeah.
And then kind of get going. I mean, I guess that. Well, Okay, it fits in a little with the other thing I wanted to talk about, which was this sort of sentiment on the left that Chris Hayes had an article in The Nation that came out a couple of months ago, and this is a big theme of Ezra Klein's on his blog. He had another post on it yesterday. This kind of like skepticism of the economics consensus and this kind of technocratic approach. And you have like at the American Prospect, where you and I both used to work, enormous like animus toward Robert Rubin and kind of conventional thinking about trade policy, about budget deficits, that kind of thing. Which on the one hand, it seems like, well, there is a real problem with that kind of technocratic approach, because it assumes a kind of a good faith partner on the other side. But then the flip side is that if I were Greg Mankiw, who is a real economist, is a professor at Harvard, and but worked for George W. Bush and worked for Mitt Romney, and I were trying to think like, well, okay, what am I going to say to John Chait? I would say, well, look, you're looking at a very narrow set of issues where our politicians, sure, they cut some corners for political convenience, but look at what Democrats say about trade. Look at all this kind of similar sort of, I think, in some ways, populist, skepticism of basic models of how the labor market works, things like that.
Yeah. That's kind of interesting. Are you familiar with Paul Krugman's book called Peddling Prosperity?
Yeah, I am, which was kind of, this was something I was going to bring up, so go for it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's kind of an interesting document, because he begins by talking about how crazy the supply-siders are and how totally outside of the academia that they're from and illegitimate. But he has this whole idea of like real economists versus pretend economists. And then at the end of the book, he has like a chapter or two on people on the left, and there's this kind of equation between the two. And I think he talks about like Lester Thoreau and Robert Reich.
Rubin.
Not Rubin, too?
Bob
Reich.
Right.
Yeah. Like strategic traders and populists of that sort. And I think I think he was bending over way too far backwards to be nonpartisan in making that comparison. I think you could certainly raise a lot of objections to the strategic traders and the kinds of stuff that Reich and Thoreau, the popular arguments they're trying to make. But the parallel is not a very strong one. Krugman doesn't bend over backwards to do that kind of thing anymore.
Sure.
But Krugman himself was a widely derided figure. I mean, this infuriated, quite understandably, people on the left. And the American Prospect in the late 1990s had a cover story by Robert Kuttner, attacking Krugman. It had this very unfriendly caricature of Krugman on the cover, and it was this pretty vicious, no holds barred attack that I think it made a couple fair points in rebuttal. I think it probably went way too far.
Right, but to what extent then, though, is this kind of thing like, Krugman has obviously decided over the years that, that's not the position he wants to stake out, with his column at the New York Times. Your book, even though it has a similar subject matter in some ways to his older book, has a very different sort of stance and attitude and story it wants to tell, where it's no longer something about ignorant people making mistakes, and it becomes about much darker, really, and about a one-sided story of a takeover.
Yeah.
But how much of that change in focus is just a sort of a partisan decision to say, well, I'm going to ignore the foibles of my allies because we're really all on the same side.
I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of it is just like the shock at the Bush administration and how awful they've been in that. And just sort of, I mean, if you're asking me specifically about Krugman and his change, it's just thinking like that's the most important thing. I want to hammer that point home every single column I have. I think.
Right, but I guess what I'm getting at, and because this is something I feel like your book and your Netroots piece in some ways left a little ambiguous, which is that, I mean, like you write about certain things that you think make the left less politically effective than the right.
Right.
But you tend to write about them, I think, in a very kind of admiring sort of way. And I mean, or not. I mean, do you think it would be good and it's important for left of center intellectuals to whip ourselves into a more effective and disciplined, kind of machine that can push back against this? Or
that's the big dilemma. And my answer is, someone needs to do it. I don't want that someone to be me. It's just not what I want to do. It's not what I think I'd be good at. But I think someone else needs to do that. I guess that's the best answer I can give, which isn't a totally satisfying answer, because I'm saying, if I really think it's this important, I should care less about what I want to do and just like spend every day trying to work for what I think will create the best future for my country. But that's just not the decision I've come to.
Right? No, sure. No, I mean, I guess I don't have like a great really answer to that sort of dilemma either, because I agree. It's like one of the things you get at like writing a blog and just write so frequently is you get emails from people saying, well, why aren't you writing about this? Like, why do you care about that? So on and so forth. And like oftentimes people who do and complain about these kind of things are, I think making valid points about what's the objective importance of X versus Y, but it's really like what makes it a fun job is getting to pick what you want to write about and say what you want to say, and pick the fights that you choose to pick rather than the ones that seem most kind of central. But at the same time, it is I do try to. I do think it makes sense to say that one needs to take seriously a certain kind of responsibility as someone who's going to be trying to act in a public stage. I mean, not I think to lie or cover up insidious crimes,
right.
But to try and think about what kind of impact you're having on the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. I just think there are other kinds of impacts too, and I think the country also needs a certain space in public discourse of people who aren't just trying to move people toward the positions they want to move them toward. So to say, admit, hey, maybe we shouldn't be listening to Cindy Sheehan. No, I mean, no one on the left wants to listen to Cindy Sheehan anymore, because now they all realize how nuts she is. But like, even when she was just being a problem for President Bush and not a problem for the Democrats, to sort of to say, things like that. I think that also has not just some abstract value, but I think that has a very real value to the public and to the country to have people who do that. So I guess, I assume that's probably some form of the same rationalization you make too. Why and sometimes you just need to concede, hey, people on my side are kind of screwing up in this way or that way, or this isn't the best argument for this is an argument for my own, this is an argument for my position, but I don't quite agree with it, whatnot.
Oh, sure. It does happen, but it's still like hard to. I don't know. I don't have a totally clear kind of view on this. I go back and forth. And I'll admit that sometimes when to break the fourth wall a little, we were talking about David Brooks's column on Rock, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so you said you had kind of mixed feelings about it. Which, I don't know. A bunch of.
Do you want to summarize the column for those who haven't read it?
Sure. So he says, maybe you should summarize it, because I think you're going to give it a more sympathetic engagement.
Yeah. Why don't I summarize it, then you summarize it? Basically, he's saying that the surge basically has failed, but the war in some ways is kind of succeeding. He's basically saying the surge hasn't done what it's supposed to do. And what it's supposed to do is becoming less relevant because you are having these other forms of reconciliation. He's arguing, mostly everyone knows about the Sunnis turning against Al-Qaeda. But he's also arguing that, lots of local Shiites are turning against the Mahdi army and the more radical elements of Shi'ism, and that actually turns out to be the valuable purpose that we're serving in Iraq.
Right. Now, I think, the less charitable way of putting this is that David Brooks has discovered that if we stay in Iraq forever, or not forever, but indefinitely, if we just stay month after month, dozens of Americans will die this month, dozens will die the next month, dozens will die the next month. This will be done at the cost of hundreds of billions of dollars. It will perpetually raise the prospect of some kind of international incident with the Iranians, so on and so forth. It'll shred our credibility all around the world, lead to more Al-Qaeda terrorism, so on and so forth. But, if we just keep our troops there forever at enormous expense, then at some point in time, Iraq will be a non-disintegrated society, and then I, David Brooks, will never need to admit that my advocacy of this was a mistake, and that my, apologetics in favor of that 6 months ago, when I was saying, oh, this surge is a great idea, I was wrong. That I was wrong a year before that about the latest thing, and that in fact, consistently for years, I have been coming up with new and new and new rationales for why we can't leave Iraq. Each time they prove false, but look, I'm a clever guy, so I can spin out a new one.
I think my summary was a little bit more of a direct textual reading of his column.
Well, sure, right. But this is why I brought it up in this context, though, which is that, I become, as I think you know, very sort of frustrated with the position of earnest diffidence that I think you and some other people have taken.
Yeah.
With regard to this, that there's a sense of not. It seems to me that this is an issue where one has something of an obligation to really try and make up one's mind.
Yeah.
That it's too big and it's too pressing. And I will admit in this venue that of course I can't say with 100% certainty what will and won't happen, and so on and so forth. But that, to me, we have clearly reached a point at which, enough is enough of this stuff.
Right. Yeah,
and that if one doesn't want to take that view, something stronger needs to be said in favor of it than, just a little more, let's see, it's hard to say, blah, blah.
It's true, but what if you, have this debate with yourself every day, and you just never get past, you're always either 55-45 for leaving or 55-45 for staying. It's sort of just moved back and forth between those two positions of being very weakly for one position, then very weakly for the other. That's the position I'm in. I think that's a position a lot of people are in. Ross Douthat seems to be in that position. And it's tricky. And the other thing is that, your words have a kind of permanence to them. And this is another thing that the rise of the internet has brought about.
Sure.
The whole idea of accountability, which I'm for. I've been trying to, that's sort of been my thing for a long, long time, is say, hey, you wrote this, you were wrong. But, you have to be careful. I was sort of as a kind of thought exercise, I did this, I don't know, a year ago, saying when Saddam Hussein was alive, obviously, saying hey, maybe we should just put Saddam Hussein back in power. And I did, and my point was that I probably thought that was a bad idea, but on the other hand, I couldn't think of any arguments as to why it was a bad idea, or at least, I could think of I knew what the obvious downsides were, but
no, sure.
But if you actually, it was hard for me to actually think about why this was worse than the alternatives. But it just got ripped to shreds by everyone. Because sort of what I'm
right,
that is you
that
can't
to
just
me
take
just mostly seemed like people being obtuse.
Yeah, I think it was a lot of people obtuse, but I think there were some. It was. You're right, but the problem is you can't. It's just hard to have a provisional stance. This is where I am this week. Check back next week, and maybe I'll have another position. It's just really hard to do that, and especially when everything you do lives forever. So, I don't feel like I. Whatever. When I can argue both sides of the question, and I'm going back and forth on a near weekly basis, I just tell me tell me what I should be doing differently.
No, I don't know. It's fair enough, maybe. because I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, this is primarily, what I write about, and it's not for everyone. And I'm sure there's things where I am similarly indecisive. But to get more specific about Brooks's column, I think the problem with it is that the whole concept of bottom-up reconciliation, which is the sort of official talking points term for the phenomenon Brooks is talking about, it's this kind of word game that this thing isn't like a different kind of intercommunal reconciliation. It's just not intercommunal reconciliation at all. What it is that it's the reverse of reconciliation. It's further splintering of like the Sunni camp into one camp that wants to wage genocidal war against Shiites and also ally with Al-Qaeda, and one that wants to wage merciless war against Shiites but wants to get American guns to do it with by helping us fight Al-Qaeda first. And even there's a thing in a
that seems slightly unfair.
Column where he very breezily is like, well, moderate Shiite groups are tackling the Sadrists in some southern cities. But then if you read like an account of what's happening in Basra, it's not like, well, some really nice, respectable, moderate Shiite forces, are turning on these baddie extremists. There's rival, basically, street gangs controlling different parts of the city, controlling different levels of governmental institutions, killing each other as part of kind of, fairly long-standing split between the Al-Hakim family and the Sadr family, where the moderates, in this case, are the ones who've all fled Iraq and, took refuge in Iran, and who, appear to me to have been designated the good guys in this fight through a basically arbitrary process. But be that as it may, even if they are better, what Brooks is really looking at is more intense breakdowns of Iraqi society. And there's no sign of, like, the Anbar Awakening group, who, we're all enthusiastic about because they're fighting AQI, actually coming to terms with the Iran-based Shiite exile parties and some sort of coming together of a state.
Right.
And nor is there any particular evidence that American policy is driving any of these dynamics.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. Let me make a couple points in response.
Okay.
And as I was saying offline, I can kind of argue both sides of this question. So I'm going to come off as being more conservative on this than I would if I was here with someone from the Weekly Standard. I'd be sounding a lot like you. But
right.
But so let me give you the devil's advocate side. Number one, I think the best argument you had for us leaving, which I was really starting to come around to for a long time, I was maybe moving past 55, 45, is that we were essentially on the wrong side of the war. That essentially our efforts couldn't succeed because they were counterproductive. We were supporting a Shiite government that was viciously sectarian, and we were sort of training the death squad, supporting the death squads, and so we should stop doing that. Even if it fails, we're sort of moving things in the wrong. The more we succeed, the worse it gets. Which I think was, I was increasingly, like I said, persuaded by that. But now essentially, it feels like we're making up for that in some sense with the Sunnis. And you're right that they're not committed to reconciling with the Shiites, quite understandably so. Certainly not with the the Maliki death squad kind of government.
Right.
But it seems like if you can bolster the Sunnis more, fighting Al-Qaeda is not an insignificant goal, even though it's Al-Qaeda in Iraq, it's not the real Al-Qaeda, etc.
Sure.
It's still a threat. And B, you can bring into balance the forces a little bit more that we sort of probably pushed out of whack, and force the Shiites to make the concessions that we've been unable to get them otherwise to make. Right? I mean, is there any other way to force them to make concessions than to build up their enemies so that they can't just run roughshod over them?
Well, but I mean, I still think there is. I mean, we're building up both sides now. I mean, this was the easiest kind of leverage that we ever, had was to stop building up the Shiites. But instead, right, I mean, the direction we seem to be leaning in is, on the one hand, build up these Sunni forces. On the other hand, continue training and equipping the official Iraq security forces. And then on the third hand, maybe try and engineer a coup. Sorry, I shouldn't say coup, because that was how it started, but then this calmed down. But try to engineer some kind of change of government so that Maliki is replaced with somebody else. But we're not, at that level, not actually addressing the bottom-up factors, which is that, there's no evidence that Maliki is some uniquely malign figure, rather than that he represents the sort of baseline view that all the Shiites have, which is that they are afraid of a Sunni return to dominance. And I just have kept not seeing for 2.5 years now, I would say, like a way for the United States to resolve this problem, and what we've done since that time is try a lot of different permutations, and in some ways you have to give the Bush administration credit for being, I think, fairly exhaustive, starting in 2005 in like the different kind of ways they want to try and move the pieces around on this board, and it's just not there. And if we weren't there, maybe they would reach some... To be optimistic, I can say, well, if we got out of the way, maybe people would look at this and say, wait, wouldn't it be better to negotiate some kind of settlement? There was a time when I really thought that, when I was optimistic about that, but that time sort of passed. But at the moment, the strategy seems to be to just kind of sit around on the sidelines, hope for the best, and whatever the outcome is, just kind of proclaim it a success. That's in particular what Brooks's column sounded like just a determination to move the goalposts to, wherever the ball happens to land, and therefore get to avoid not just the personal embarrassment of, to certain hawks of admitting they were wrong, but the national embarrassment of admitting that, as a country, we sort of failed here.
Well, maybe, but the motives aren't really the important thing. It's
well, no, but it's not a question of the motive. I mean, it's a question of what is the objective of the American mission in Iraq, right? I mean, what strategic goals?
Well, you could say,
is David Brooks's vision advancing here?
Premise number one, I'm not sure you agree with this premise, but why don't we just accept it for the sake of argument, even if you don't, which is that the American military presence there is keeping a lid on the violence, right? It's preventing some even wider, deeper breakdown, some bigger bloodbath from taking place. Now, maybe just delaying it, but that's the short-term and immediate effect of our presence. So then you can say, well, so then now if we're actually sort of like organizing the Sunnis into an anti-Al-Qaeda force that we think could be a positive impact, as opposed to a more radicalized force that we really don't want to have any role in the future government of Iraq, and building up their strength. Now, granted, we're also still helping the Shiites, but like relatively, we're changing the relative balance of power as opposed to just building up the Shiites. We're changing the relative balance of power. There's some reasonable chance that this will force the Shiites to make concessions that they've been unwilling to make, and lead to some kind of reconciliation in not forever. Is that an unreasonable? That essentially, if we pull out, we take the lid off, and then bloodbath ensues, and that process gets short-circuited. Is that? Tell me what's wrong with that argument.
But, honestly, this is the kind of argument that makes me start questioning people's motives. Like, I think one could not in a million years imagine talking to a 19-year-old who is about to ship off to Iraq and looking him in the eye and saying that was what he was being sent out to do. Brooks mentions in his column this Anthony Cordesman paper called the Tenuous Case for Strategic Patience, I think is what it's called, which I thought had he's a great guy, knows this stuff better than anyone, a great, analysis of the situation, and then a kind of prescription, at the end where he makes the case, which, as he says, is tenuous, and it's a case for patience, as he says, and it just struck me as almost laughable that someone would look at this whole long analysis and then say, so what I'm saying at the end is if we just kind of stick it out and keep doing this stuff for an undetermined period of time, it might work out. I think the phrase he uses is that, like, if we keep doing this and show a commitment to keep doing it, the odds of failure might drop below 50% or something.
Right.
And that kind of thing, to me, once one leaves a certain mindset, I think, about this, just like a little bizarre. Like we're just not subjecting these kind of ideas to any kind of cost-benefit test or any kind of sort of reasonable supposition other than the idea that achieving something that we can plausibly call success has an almost infinite value. So that, as long as the skeptic can't prove with 100% certainty that you won't possibly succeed, there continues to be this tenuous case for patience, which is, patience in that category is a condescending term, as if it's really impatient of Americans to say, well, okay, this has gone on longer than the American Civil War at this point. Like, can't we be done with it?
I agree with you that there are people. I think what you're describing does describe some people's thinking. I don't know by Quarterman. I think probably not. It's definitely not my thinking. I don't give 100.
I don't think that's your or Tony Quarterman's explicit sort of thinking about this. It just seems to me that there's almost a kind of a tunnel vision when those sort of analyses get made.
Yeah, whatever. I didn't make explicit, some of the underlying premises, but if, the sort of the case I made, right, you keep a lid on, build up the Shiites, maybe so doing force the Sunni, build up the Sunnis, force the Shiites to make concessions, that has a chance, a reasonable chance to work. You're right. I think there does have to be a cost-benefit analysis. Is there some reasonable chance of this working, and what do you think the costs are? What are the chances of success? I don't know. You're taking guesses. If you could throw out numbers, but what's the?
Obviously, everybody's taking guesses. But I feel like the argument, like you're going there, right? Like the whole lid proposition. That sounds plausible. Obviously, and I'm inclined to concede it for the sake of argument. But as long as one's saying, well, we'll try this, and maybe it will cause the Sunnis and the Shiites to reconcile, one also needs to add in other kind of maybes, like us leaving might freak people out and help promote reconciliation. Us staying and giving more and more, introducing more and more guns into the situation, may in fact be making the conflict more lethal.
Yeah, though I think we're probably past. There's just like a point of diminishing returns, and I think basically like everyone who wants to shoot anybody has enough access to a gun now that the pumping.
Oh no! But that's really wrong. There's very little heavy military equipment in Iraq at the moment, and that's something that the parties there would like. That there are some kind of long-term kind of plans to establish, and the Sunni tribes in particular, as part of this, are clearly receiving tangible benefits from the Americans, and that if we have
money and combat training, right, and rifles, money, rifles, and combat training is my understanding. They're not getting artillery and jet fighters.
Well, no, they're not getting jet fighters, although there are some kind of plans to create Iraqi Air Force, but that seems to be kind of on hold. But they feel that they are fighting more effectively with this additional stuff, and I think this is why. There's a reason why Maliki hasn't just told us to get on the bus out of Iraq yet. And that's that, he too feels that his forces are gaining in some kind of strength here. So trying to achieve peace by arming people up to a level,
and we're also fighting the guerrillas.
What?
We're fighting the Sunni guerrillas too, that are trying to overthrow his government. So that's another useful thing we do for.
Well, no, now we're arming the Sunni guerrillas who are trying to overthrow the government.
But they're still
also fighting some different ones.
Right, exactly. But
that's what I mean. That it seems like in that case, right, that it's a situation where victory has become its own objective. We're helping one band of guerrillas fight a different one, and we're also helping the government that's fighting maybe both of them, and that the hope is just that, like at the end of this fracas, someone comes out on top who, will give a medal to whoever the president is.
Well, look, victory is a silly notion. I realize a lot of Republicans are going to want to call it victory, which would be absurd. I mean, we'll obviously be much worse off at the end of this war than we were at the beginning. There's no conceivable outcome that will have been considered a success. But whatever, you don't consider sunk costs when you consider future actions, right? So I mean, it's just a question.
Sure. Right. I just mean that the policy objectives themselves seem to have become, to me, incredibly murky, and that the main that given that we've more or less given up on any kind of clear chance of creating, any kind of meaningful, okay, these are the steps we're going to take that's going to result in some kind of friendly liberal democratic government, that instead it's just, we'll stay, and here I can give a plausible account of how, if these things go right, there'll be a stable outcome. But one can also give that same kind of contingent argument for why there'll be stability if we leave.
Look, we're really bumping up against the time limit, so let me just make one more point. You can rebut, and then we should stop it. I do think there are some pretty clear objectives. It's all about avoiding really, really awful outcomes. It's avoiding mass genocide, a failed state that can be, like Afghanistan writ large with more oil resources on the table. Just like an overwhelmingly huge strategic disaster as opposed to, a more contained one. I think that's the objective. It's avoiding this really, really awful possibility with something that's with having some kind of relatively stable state.
So the basic point is
that's not victory, but that's the goal.
To avoid it. I mean, well, okay. I'll just end on the provocative note that I don't see any particular evidence that there's a really high likelihood of genocide occurring if we leave, and I haven't seen really clear thinking as to why that. So I would like someone to lay down for me what. Just roughly, what they think the probabilities are there, what they think the price is worth doing, why this, why it's worth expending this many resources in that kind of way, and why it is politically that absolutely everybody who needs to make claims about the need of continuing the war to either voters or soldiers doesn't say anything like that.
I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true that they don't say anything like that. I agree.
What don't you think is true?
They try to. I think George W. Bush tends to have the most high. But they talk about leaving a state that would become an incubator of terrorism like Afghanistan. They do sort of make that argument.
But they're making the argument that if we leave, Al Qaeda or possibly Al Qaeda in alliance with Iran will take over Iraq, and it will be a direct threat to America.
Well, sure, that's the most extreme version of it, but I think there are people who make a more serious and less hyperbolic version of the claim. And even if they don't, if the claim is true, then it's true.
But I mean, I do think it bears asking as to why it is that there's this Iraq from the beginning has been shot through with, and I think in retrospect we could say utterly corrupted by this endless series of esoteric agendas and so forth, and that at some point one has to start thinking, like, why is it that this policy is so great, and yet the people who need to sell it in practice and govern the country on its basis lie constantly about every aspect of it.
Right. Well, that's sort of a different question. I mean,
no, sure.
I think it's a serious point. I mean, I think it's one that's overstated by a lot of liberal bloggers. I think sometimes policies are unpopular or at least hard to explain. You know, I mean, I think when Democratic politicians argue for affirmative action, they just lie all the time because what they want is just
I'll but like that strikes me as an example of a policy that's like not that good, which is why it needs to be defended.
That's true. That's true. Although I think the reason that it's flawed and need to be at least changed, although not in my opinion totally.
Well, okay,
done away with.
We're getting far off.
But in any case, I think I don't think there's really any. In other words, to believe what you're believing, you have to believe that the American public is always right, and I don't believe that.
No, I don't believe the American public is always right. I think it's a telling consideration to keep in mind.
I agree.
That one should, have some doubts about a policy that needs to be that politically needs to be sustained through dishonesty, and why exactly that is.
Why don't we have this? Why don't we have this discussion next? We're getting into a whole other topic. Why don't we have this one next time?
Sure. All right.
I think we're way over our time limit here.
All right. Bye, John Chait's book.
Nice talking with you, Matt.
Yes.
Okay.